Mrs. Muzzy's house was owned by the Teeles a long time ago, and we were lucky enough to come back to this house in the 80s. And you'll often appreciate that as you drive by or walk by that there are flags on the porch. And the flags are an important part of introducing this talk. Of course, the American flag is there. I'm British, so the Union Jack is in the middle. And the flag on this side is the New Zealand flag. Now, some folks think it's actually Australian, but we call that the West Island, not the South Island of New Zealand. And the reason that I got interested in plants and flowers is because of the New Zealand connection, but it all wraps up with these three countries. When we went to New Zealand to live, this was in 1992, we were in Christchurch. We moved from Christchurch to a place called Arrowtown, and luckily we're not in Christchurch when the earthquake hit. But Arrowtown is in the mountains on the South Island, and there are lots of walking tracks. Tracks are trails in American speak. And the tracks had lots of interesting flowers. Now, I think it's because you appreciate another place sometimes more often than you appreciate your own in terms of novelty. And I looked for a guidebook, and I couldn't find one. So with my son and with his girlfriend, we wrote one. So we started from scratch. So the bottom line of all of this talk is that I am not a botanist. I know nothing except what I'm going to show you tonight because I've researched those particular flowers. But interestingly, when we came back from Arrowtown to Annisquam, another A word, and started walking around here, I appreciated that, in fact, the flowers were the same. And it's all due to our British ancestors who traipsed to this part of the world first with all of their flowers, aka weeds, and then got to New Zealand later, because New Zealand really didn't get colonized until about 1840 in any significant sense. So this little book led to my interest in Annisquam flowers. I took this photograph in New Zealand, but I could have taken it on the pasture last week because it's clover. And there's a little four-leaf clover in the corner to remind me that I'm lucky to have been in two wonderful places during my lifetime. But this is clover. Now, we just take it for granted. We pull it out of the garden when it's in the wrong place. But it's a very interesting plant, an interesting flower, because it provided pasture land for the early New Zealanders. And, of course, it provided pasture here as well. And there's a lot of it in our pasture. There are two major types of clover. White clover, Trifolium repens, means creeping, and red clover, Trifolium pratense. And you'll find both of these in Annisquam. Why are they interesting? Well, it turned out that the white clover was brought to New Zealand for pasture. A mite managed to destroy a lot of the clover itself. The farmers there thought, well, we'll import red clover and see if we can get around the insect problem, but it wouldn't set seed. Red clover needs bumblebees with their longer snouts or proboscis in order to get the pollen to set the seed. So in New Zealand, the story is we had to import bumblebees to actually use our red clover. And it just comes back to this whole process of ecology, that there's a symbiosis between all of the things that we see around us, the flora and the fauna. I'm going to stick with flora today. If you haven't read up on your Japanese recently, I've put it in English at the bottom, this haiku. Hearing its name, I looked at it and knew this flowering weed. And that's what happened to me. I looked at these flowers, and then I thought, gee, I wonder what that is. And as soon as I found the name and learned some of the history behind the Latin, the Greek, etc., then it became much more interesting. So now weeding the garden is sort of like, ouch, damn pyraceum or something like that, instead of, oh, damn flower. So this is what we're going to talk about the Annisquam wildflowers. And of course, I have a picture of the pasture because that's where most folks think they are. But in fact, most of the flowers that you'll see are along the wayside and in gardens like our back garden where I haven't weeded very frequently. So Why do we have them here? This is the person who's responsible for many of the imports. This is not the Winthrop of the Massachusetts colony. It's the Winthrop who was his son, who was brought to run Connecticut colony. Now, actually, John Winthrop did live here. He lived in Ipswich, actually, and then went home to England after his wife and baby died, but was brought back to settle this new colony in Connecticut. But when he came back, it was apparent that he wasn't just a leader. He was a chemist, a scientist, and he was a physician. And his list of necessary plants was very extensive. And this is what it was. Now, this is over 100 plants or seeds that he ordered from England. So you can thank him for many of the plants that we see around here. And what I've done is put a little red mark besides the ones that I'm going to talk about in the first part of this talk. The first part has to do with things that were imported from his list. And the second part is an interactive part where you're going to tell me what you think some of the plants are as we take a walk from Leonard Street down to the pasture. And I'll probably spend the next 40 minutes doing that. And then the real gardeners and the real botanists in the audience can then add in all of their comments after that. Okay? So we're going to start, I'll start with dandelion because that's the one that everybody knows. And of course, it looks beautiful when you look at it up close. And if you go on the net and look up the three words yellow, bee, and flower, you will find out that bees see these colors in a different spectrum, including ultraviolet, than do we. And many of flowers, which we just take for granted as being just strap yellow flowers, actually have much more of a pattern in them. Many of the flowers around here are these yellow strap flowers, but all of the parts of a dandelion are edible, so that was important. Importantly, you could use them for wine and root beer. And the early colonists here put more beer on the ships to come over than they did water. It's also used as a diuretic. So the French called it pissenlit. As you probably all know, dandelion meant the teeth of the leaves. They looked like lion's teeth. And taraxacum is actually a word that comes from the Arabic. So the Arabic scholars had described this plant many, many hundreds of years before. Officinale, if you see that in a species name, means that it's associated with an apothecary, a medical, or a herbal use. So that gives you an idea that people knew that this was something they could use in a medicinal fashion. This was just taken a couple of weeks ago up near Norwood Heights, and if you asked anybody going past this, oh, what are those yellow flowers, and they got a quick look, they'd probably say, oh, they must be dandelions, because we're so familiar with them. But you can appreciate that this is a group of flowers that are branched, and dandelions aren't branched. And then, if you look further, which is what I have now been trained to do by the botanists who rolled their eyes when I showed them a picture of a flower, and they said, but where's the rest of the plant? If you look at the leaves, they look like they're clasping the stems. So it's a very typical appearance of this particular kind of plant, and there are two types. This one was from, I think this one was from Rockholm, and the other one that I'm going to show you is from Norwood Heights. One is soft, one is prickly, so you can decide which side you want to be on for these flowers. But these are called sonchus, and their common name is sow thistle. Olearaceous means that it's a vegetable-like sonchus, and that's a very old term, probably referring to an old town. And sonchus asper means that it's sharp, and you can tell the difference. Just hold the leaves, and one's very leathery and sharply edged, and the other's very soft and floppy. The soft and floppy one you can eat. It was given to sows because it was thought that that would increase their lactation, but people eat them. And if you're interested in unusual things for your dinner, this is a good website, eattheweeds.com. He's got about 150 or 135 videos on YouTube, and you can learn all about those plants that you can eat. So now you come to something like this, and you go, Well, she said they're not all dandelions, but what are they? And when we were working on this in New Zealand for the book, we had a label for this. They were called DYFs, Damn Yellow Flowers, because they all look very similar. You have to know a lot more about botany than I usually can conjure up. And you can see there's a wiry looking flower on the right, and I took that outside Steve Harris's house so that he would see something familiar. Where is he, Steve? And the others are from all over the place in Annisquam. And this is a very useful website if any of you want to try and key in some of these wildflowers and do it properly. It's gobotany.newenglandwild.org, and it's the New England Wildflower website. And I can give this to anybody who wants to send me an email. But what it allows you to do is key in certain features of whatever flower plant that you're looking at, and it'll come up with a general category and often more specifically what that flower is. So it's a very useful website. Now, I'm showing you a small picture from the back, but most of those are hieraceum, that word I used before. And hieraceum means hawk. Now, why would these be called hawkweeds? And most of them are in that category. Lots of different species names. It was thought early on, BC, that the hawk, his eyesight was improved by the juice of those yellow flowers. So that story has carried on through 2 centuries at least, and now we think of these as hawkweeds, but most people don't know where that story came from. They're DYFs as far as I'm concerned. Very tough to sort them out. This is not a dandelion, looks a little bit like one and can be mistaken for one at a brief glance. And there's a little patch of these right in the dip of Leonard Street as you go up towards the church. It's coltsfoot. It's also called sun before father because in England, because it's very unusual in the sense that the flower blossoms long before the leaves come out. And the leaves are supposed to look like a coltsfoot, hence the name. And you'll see the Latin name Tussilago farfara. I'm sure you've seen on drugs things, antitussive. So this was thought by early folks to have an antitussive or a preventative medical effect against coughing. And it was used in colonial times as a treatment for whooping cough. A lot of faith, but that was what it was done for. And British herb tobacco includes this. And I think the most interesting thing is that on the door of a Paris apothecary, they would have this flower drawn. Many people were illiterate, but if you saw this flower drawn on a shop, you would know that it's the apothecary's shop. This is the bane of many gardeners around here, and it was brought here for a purpose. And this is dock, and it's these little tiny green, almost minuscule flowers early on, which turn into these horrible brown seeds, often more than 100,000 per plant. And it can spread all over the place, and it has a very long taproot, which is difficult to get out. But why was it brought here? Well, first of all, it's part of the sorrel family, and sorrels and docks were brought here. It means multitude, the actual term of dock. And it was used as a wrap for butter. So if you think about it, there wasn't very much saran wrap around when the colonists got off the Mayflower. And if you were able to make a little bit of butter in your house, how were you going to carry it anywhere? How are you going to take it to market, which is what they used it for in England? It was a marketable commodity. So those big, wide leaves were used for a wrap, and then they would be tied up with some other stem to fix it in place. So sometimes you'll hear it called butter dock. But there are other kinds of docks with a different kind of leaf shape. It was also a root for tea, and it has a reputation for being able to treat skin ailments. But again, that's a little bit more folklore probably than proven medical effect. But this is all around the place, and that last picture I showed you was taken right at the intersection of Walnut Street and Leonard Street. Wonderful, pretty flower that is here every spring, has a pretty velvety leaf, and this is called feverfew. it was thought to be a febrifuge. It was thought to prevent rising fever. It's Tenacitum parthenium. We'll come back to tenacitum in a minute. It has no useful clinical effect that can be tested. And I'll mention right here that the NIH did take a lot of these herbal medicines seriously, and they set up a unit within NIH to test herbal medicines and give them a really good scientific going through. And so if you're interested in those results, they are on the NIH website. But the Parthenium, it relates to a story from Plutarch where a person building the Parthenon somehow had his life saved by feverfew. We're not sure how. I think maybe he fell into a patch of it. But I don't know. But we'll come back to tenacitum because it's also in the same family as this. If you go to the end of Nashua Avenue right now and turn left, you'll see bushes of dying tenacitum. Tenacitum vulgare, or tansy. Vulgare means common, usual. This is another imported plant. It was imported by Mr. Winthrop, Governor Winthrop. This is a photograph that Eleanor got for me. The butterfly and the flower, I think, are probably just under an inch long. You can see them from there. This is native to Eurasia, and interestingly, it's associated with burials. Tenacitum derives from the Greek thanatos, and that's the Greek deity in terms of death. So euthanasia comes from the same root. So tenacitum has this association with burials. It has a rather unpleasant smell as far as I'm concerned. But when they were digging up God's acre to trying to figure out where Henry Dunster, the first president of Harvard, was buried, there was a story that he was buried surrounded by tansy. And they found an old coffin that had a skull and some bones and a lot of tansy, so they declared that that must be Henry Dunster's grave. Now the problem is that he died in February. But then somebody came in and said, well, there was lots of dried tansy hanging around at the time. So it probably still is Henry Dunster. But I'm sure there are PhD theses having been written on whether or not this is truly Henry Dunster. And of course, the exhumation was done in the 1800s and they didn't have DNA available, so we'll never know. But Henry Dunster's grave has now been relocated, and you can go and see where it is in Cambridge. It was a treatment for worms. Whether it was successful or not, I'm not sure. It does continue on the pharmacopoeia in this country. And to give it a Gloucester flavor, it's mentioned by Charles Olson in the Maximus poems as tansy buttons. So it's a common plant that you'll see around Cape Ann. This is about 3 years ago, and many of you may have seen this. As you're walking up Squam Rock Road, there was this wonderful stand of purple flowers. And I'm sure everybody knows what these are. Across the street, there was an albino form. It's still called Digitalis purpurea. And this is a wonderful plant because it's probably the one plant that I'm going to show you that actually has some medical effect. And that's Digitalis for heart action and contraction. I've got a cardiologist in the audience, so I'm stumbling over my words here. Where is she? She can set me right. Sarah? Yeah, there she is. Now, the foxglove was named by Fuchs, who, by the way, fuchsia is named after Fuchs, an early botanist, but Fuchs called it fingerhoot or finger hat. We call it digitalis, digital, like fingers, and we call it foxglove, but it most likely derives from folk's glove. The fairy folks were rampant in Anglo-Saxon England. They did mischief. You know, if you couldn't find your car keys, you blamed it on the fairy folk. So I think that probably it got gradually changed into foxglove, but it really meant folk's glove. It was the fairies' gloves, because they got the right size fingers for foxglove. These little spots are bee landing areas. Okay, so that's another use for getting the bees into the, sort of channeling them right into the floret. The person who described the medical use of digitalis was this wonderful man named William Withering. He actually did not discover it. It was actually a herbal practitioner, a woman in Shropshire, who had the reputation of being able to cure dropsy. And dropsy usually was related to poor cardiac function. People got a lot of fluid in their extremities because their heart wasn't working properly. But Withering took the potion that she actually was putting together. It wasn't just foxglove, it had many other things in it, and sorted out in a scientific manner which was the important part of this potion, and it was foxglove, it was digitalis. He was an interesting man because he was part of the Lunar Society from Birmingham area, comprised of many men of science that formed essentially the Midlands Enlightenment in the end of the 1700s. And his portrait and his tomb are usually shown. His portrait has a stalk of digitalis in his hand, and his tomb has digitalis carved on it, and also another plant called Witheringia, which was named for him, which has nothing to do with digitalis. So this man really provided some of the first scientific work in terms of herbal medicine. Because until then, it was all done because somebody had passed down the information, or because something looked like it should cure something in a person. Now, you've seen lungwort around, I'm sure. It's around in Annisquam. It has these patches of white or silvery white on green on the leaf. And of course, people years and years ago would have known what pneumonia looked like in a cow, because they would have had opened the cow up and seen all these patches of things. I'm showing you a CT scan of pneumonia, and you can appreciate how that appearance looks the same as what's on the leaf. This is as a situation that occurred because of this one man who defined the doctrine of signatures. His name is spelled in different ways depending on where you find him, but he lived in the 1500s till the early 1600s, a master shoemaker and an amateur theologian. And he decided that everything on earth had a reason for being here, and that the plants, the signature of a plant, identified its use to man. And for some reason this just took off around Europe, all throughout Central Europe and into Britain, so that people would assume that if a plant had something that looked like a disease or a body part, that was what it was used for. So, in fact, shepherd's purse, which was brought in by Winthrop, capsella, little box, that means bursa pastoris, shepherd's bag, was thought to stem uterine bleeding because the seeds looked like little uteri. So it takes a little bit of imagination for some of these plants, but this one is pretty more obvious. So this whole process of the theory, if you will, it was established in the 1500s but lasted way into the early 1900s. And even now, on a lot of the websites of herbal practitioners, you'll see this signature theory persist. And I'm just showing you this photograph just as a little aside. This is the apothecary shop that's set up in Shelburne. And because this is a historical society meeting, I thought I'd better throw in some history. And this is a group of medicines that are actually on the shelf in Shelburne. I love that one on the left, wizard oil. I think that's for Harry Potter and his crew. And the one in the middle is horehound syrup. And the one on the right, which I'm going to mention a little bit more, is tongaline. Now, all of these, if you look carefully at them, most of them are alcohol. Some of them have belladonna. A couple have camphor. Other things that I don't even know. But the tongaline was the most interesting because tongaline received its name from tonga, a mixture of various barks and herbs said to be gathered by Fiji Islanders. Now, they're about 500 miles apart, Tonga and Fiji. So one can imagine the Fiji Islanders canoeing like mad across to Tonga to get their herb, whatever this was. It was quackery. So a lot of these herbal medicines persisted for a very long time and really define what physicians did, because physic means related to the natural world. Physics is study of the natural world in a different manner. but people used to be called, a practitioner of physic, Physick. If you're a physician in this country, you're probably not dealing with herbal medicines anymore. But that's how the name derived. We'll go around to Norwood Heights again. I've got Rockholm and it's Rockholm Road. And you'll see a plant that's in the middle of this island. And it was suffering a little bit from dehydration at the time. And this is mullein. And this was also brought by Mr. Winthrop. It's Verbascum thapsus. And when it's a little bit hydrated and it's in blossom, and this is quite tall. I was standing up high to get this picture, which was angled down. It can grow to my height today. It's from the Old English mullein, meaning soft. It's bearded. It's very woolly. Thapsus was a town in Tunisia, and they used these long sticks to dip into pitch and use as a torch. Campers love it because it's a tissue. It can be used as a tissue for anything. So mullein is a very useful plant to have around. And we were getting some in our garden, and I couldn't figure out where it was coming from because I hadn't seen it around before. This was a few years ago. And Susie was living with Toppy Bott across the road, and they apparently had a whole stack of it and put it in their compost heap. And we think that the seeds just sort of floated across the street and went downhill and ended up in our yard. But you'll see it around Annisquam in patches. St. John's wort is a flower that possibly is familiar to you in terms of being used as an antidepressant. And it's got an interesting story as well. Its real name is Hypericum perforatum. And hypericum means above the icon. And people used to actually put it above their window frames, especially around St. John's Day, to ward off evil. And part of the reason it was associated with St. John, if you take one of the flowers, and I haven't seen any out recently, but next spring when they come out, take one of the flowers and crush it, and you'll end up with a bruise-looking appearance to your hand because it looks like blood or a bruise on your hand. So the sap is red. And if you see the name wart, which I've shown you a couple of warts, it's an Old English word for a plant, and it typically has medicinal properties. So like that lungwort that I showed you, St. John's wort. And it has been used as an antidepressant. There are trials that are ongoing, but it's extremely marginal whether or not it has any difference from placebo. So St. John's wort, it's around, quite a bit of it's around here. Yarrow, lovely, lovely, pretty white flower if you look up close. And I'm showing you close-up images because I think that's where they are the most magical, when you look at them really close up. And this is an old flower. Yarrow is an Old English name. It's native to Europe and Asia. Again, it's brought here. And Achillea, which is its scientific name, comes from Achilles, he of the tendon. And he's reputed to have used the plant to treat his soldiers' wounds as a styptish, in other words, to stop bleeding. Millifolia means many leaves, and if you look at the leaves up close, they look like they've been cut in little feathery patterns, and that's where it gets that name. Now, this is a corum, and it's shown on this kylix, or cup, with Achilles and Patroclus, just to remind me about the healing content of the flower, attributed to the flower. But the corum is because it looks like a bunch of flowers. This is Greek for a bunch of flowers. So a child coming in with a bunch of flowers, they all stick out at different angles. Very different from an umbellifer, which is the next one. So if you look at this flower, and that's the one that Eleanor put on the poster, this is a very different pattern. It's all radiating out of a single spoke. It looks like an umbrella. And this happens to be Queen Anne's lace. And I don't think I've seen as much Queen Anne's lace around Cape Ann as I have this summer. It's been all over the place. Daucus carota, wild carrot. Each of those little umbels has another little umbrella. So it's a very composite looking flower. And possibly from the back you can't see, but there's a little dark purple floret right in the middle of most of the big ones. You won't see it in all of them, but that's very characteristic when you've got a big blossom. Now, what does that mean? Well, the story is that one purple floret was the queen, and the white florets were her lace collar. So that's one definition. I like the second one. It's a drop of blood from Queen Anne, who pricked her finger while making lace, because she was known to be a very well-trained lace maker. And the English botanist said, no, it comes from a Queen of England, but not from the Queen of England, but from Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, and the patron saint of lace makers. So you can take your choice about which definition you like, but I like the one about the blood dropping off her finger when she pricked her finger with lace making. It's also in England called bird's nest. And this is the reason why people try very hard to use the scientific names, because the popular names get moved around the globe and change ever so subtly, and you're not sure if you're talking about the same flower. It's the dying blossom is the bird's nest, and there happens to be some around right now, and looking right down it, I think you can see that it really does look like a bird's nest. So this is wild carish, or Queen Anne's lace, and this is hemlock. So you can see it's also an umbel configuration. The spoke, it comes out as in spokes, if you will, from that central point, and each of the little secondary umbels come out just like Queen Anne's lace, not quite so densely packed as Queen Anne's lace, and the leaf is different. Now, this is a slide from Arrowtown and from the hemlock that we saw there, and from research done in New Zealand, and I'll read it out for those in the back. The hemlock of England is to be found in considerable quantities in the neighborhood of Christchurch, where it was sown in the year 1885, I can't see from the angle, by a herbalist who unfortunately cannot be punished for the injury he has done the province by the introduction of this very poisonous plant. So somebody brought it in because there was this consideration that it could be used to treat arthritis. Of course, there was probably a very fine line between poisoning somebody and helping somebody. But this was in the 1800s. It's just to show you how late introduction of some of these plants occurred around the Pacific. Famous because of the death of Socrates, and hemlock being used as the poison. And its scientific name, conium, has to do from the Greek, which means to sort of wander around, be dizzy, because of the vertigo that's induced by the poison. So maculata means it's got a spotted stem. You have to be very careful with hemlock and hemlock parsley, which is a completely different group, because their leaves are slightly different, but they're different plants. I'm no botanist, as I mentioned before, but if I see something like this, I just avoid it anyway and pull everything out. Now, for the second part, I'm on time, we're going to take a walk down to Lighthouse Beach, and we're going to start out somewhere around Leonard Street or Walnut Street. Many of these flowers, as I've mentioned, can be found in different areas around Annisquam. The beach is going to have some of the more interesting ones, and as is the pasture, but we'll start down the street. And this is the first thing that we might see. Anybody want to yell it out? Quiet group? Plantain, absolutely. And the reason that this is used as my first plant, if you will, again, the flowers are very small. The leaves are more obvious, as wide leaves that fan out from the base. You can actually use the seeds for budgies. If you have a budgie or a canary in your house, you can dry the seeds. But in fact, this came with the Europeans, and it was a sign that the white man had been in the area when the Native Americans saw this plant. And it goes back to Longfellow's poem, "Wheresoe'er they tread beneath them springs a flower unknown among us, springs the white man's foot in blossom." So it was known as white man's foot, and I thought it was a good one to start as we went off to the pasture, which of course was Native American ground for many years. And there's two plantains. The common one is the one I showed you. The English plantain, the lanceolata, I'm saying two that I've found here. This is just a picture of the blossom of it. But they blossom very quickly, it seems. You don't see the blossom very much, and then you just see the leaves. So plantain. How about this one? Common name is fine. Anybody? Mustard weed. And this is I haven't been able to find any other area where it's called mustard weed, but it certainly is in this part of the world, in this area. I've taken a picture where you can see the flower face on and the flower sort of on side. And the stamens actually stick out quite a bit. And you can see the seed pod, and you can see a bit of a leaf there as well. This is also called celandine. Unfortunately, celandine's used for another flower in England, so there's confusion there. And I've put mustard weed here because that's what we tend to call it, and that's what K.P. Teele, David's mother, called it in our garden. And when you break the stem, orange juice drips out, and you get it all over your hands and your clothes. And it looks like mustard. Now, you can tell me if I'm wrong. I don't know whether this is chelidonium or chelidonium, but it has to do with swallows. That's the root for swallows. And it was thought to blossom when the swallows came back to their nest. So a lot of these Greek and Latin derivations are really tortuous in terms of trying to figure out which plant they belong to, because it was somebody's idea many years ago that this has to do with swallows. Doesn't even look like one. So this is around here very, very common. And this is for Al, because this plant actually happens to be pretty much opposite where Al's driveway is. Anybody know what this is? There's a clue if I've told you it's for Al. One of our good friends lived down that driveway too, Bouncing Bet. It's often pink. So I found one just recently that had this pink tinge, but very frequently you'll see it as a white. As it gets older, it tends to have its petals blown back like this. I'm not sure who Bet was, who was bouncing. It's also known as soapwort. And again, look at this officinalis again. Saponaria, soap. Officinalis, known to be a plant that you could turn into a soap, and has that use, and is still used for that purpose. Whereas this one, I do have an idea where the name comes from. This is a native, Black-Eyed Susan, absolutely, and this is just down by Chester Square. And this is Rudbeckia hirta. Rudbeck was another botanist, and he got a plant named after him. Hirta means hairy. They're very fuzzy plants. But I thought this was a nice botanical poem, and it was written in around the 1720s, and it was thought that possibly when people were starting to name American flowers, that this ballad, which talks about all in the dawn the fleet was moored, the streamers waving to the wind, when black-eyed Susan came on board, where shall I my true love find? So this was a ballad that John Gay of the Beggar's Opera wrote, and people think that the flower was then named for Black-Eyed Susan. How about this one? We're still walking down a street. We haven't even got to the pasture yet. Spring, early summer. You have to, you probably wouldn't look at the flower this way. You'd see it on edge, so you don't look over it. It's got 4 petals, which is rather typical for the cruciates. And if you rub that leaf, it doesn't smell very good. You ready? Oh, good. See there. This is my way of finding out what kind of questions I'm going to get at the end here. This is garlic mustard, and it was imported in the 1860s. So it was a late comer. It's now invasive, and crushed leaf smell of garlic, but kind of a fuzzy garlic smell. And you can see that the seed pods are coming out like a lot of mustardy seed pods. So take a look next spring, especially along the roadsides. It covers the roadsides around here, especially if you're going down towards the market on the river road. Who has it? Are there any Gales in the audience? Yes. This is up near the Gale house. Spiderwort. There's tons of it around. And again, it's got a name. It's wort. It was thought to have a herbal purpose. The question is where the name spider comes from. It kind of looks like a spider to me, these sort of droopy stems, etc. It's got a name, though, that's unusual. Tradescantia virginia, and it's a native. So I've shown you lots of alien flowers. But this one is named after the gardener, this happens to be the gardener, to King Charles I of England. He's the younger son. His father preceded him. but both were in communication with people from Virginia, and they managed to get seeds of spiderwort, and the name of the flower was given to him. We don't know why the moss is on the skull that's in front of him. This portrait is in the National Gallery, and it's not a very good explanation of what that all means, and it looks kind of disgusting, so I'm going to pass that one. But this is, if you can't figure, if a name doesn't look Latin or Greek, it means that it's some botanist who's gotten their name on it, or some gardener, or some friend of Linnaeus, you know. This one looks like a spiderwort a little bit, but it's not. It's got 2 blue leaves and 1 little white one. And again, if you're looking down on them, you won't see that little insignificant white petal, not leaf, underneath. Anybody know what this one is? It's out right now. Where did we see a lot? We saw quite a few down near where the old post office is, again along River Road. This is Asiatic dayflower. It only comes out for a day, and then another blossom occurs. And it's again named after a botanist. And this is a Dutch botanist, Commelin. Commelina communis, grows in clumps. And Commelin looks very grand. He's not holding the flower that he discovered. He discovered the geranium, or named the geranium. So often the name of the plant has nothing to do with the particular flower that the botanist is famous for. It's just that they were all pals and all good friends. Oh, and Linnaeus had a habit. If he didn't like somebody and it was a horrible plant with a bad smell or lots of thorns or whatever, he'd name it after somebody he didn't like. So this is up at Nashua Avenue, and it's starting to die now, so it's a little peaked. I'll show you one in close-up that it's a bit better seen. And it's called butter and eggs in lots of places. It's also called toad flax. Linaria means flax, or from the flax family, vulgaris, common. The toad flax part is because, again, the Latin got mixed up. It was thought useful to treat buboes, or swellings. The root for toad is bufo, and so somehow it got mixed up with toads, and it's one of these scrambled etymologic puzzles where after a headache for trying to sort this out, I just said, I'm going to call it butter and eggs. Much easier to teach my grandchildren that than explain why there shouldn't be a toad nearby. So Linaria vulgaris, and it's a beautiful little plant, and you'll see it around, small. Now, Patsy Whitlock cut these down. Where is Patsy? Okay. Yep, Patsy Whitlock hired the brothers to clear out that corner around, which is a very good thing, the corner around the intersection of Walnut and Leonard that was overgrown. Didn't you? Yes, you did. And we're very grateful for you, Patsy, because we don't crash into cars, and we can see a little better around that corner. But there was a beautiful stand of this there. Do you know? Anybody know what this is? I'll show you in... do you know what this is? You see it all the time. Now this is out all over the place now. The little track on Adams Hill Road that goes between, I can't remember all the street names, Planter's Neck Road and Adams Hill Road. There's a lot of this out right now, the seed pods, and I think it's lovely. Money plant, silver dollar plant, honesty. The children love it because of the papery feel of the coverings. Native of the Balkans. Who knew, right? Until you look this up, you never know. And the other interesting thing about this, it's known as Judas penning in the Netherlands because of the allusion to Judas Iscariot and the 30 pieces of silver. A spring blossom. This is a mutant, actually, because this has 8 petals. Now, there aren't very many flowers around that have 8 petals, and this usually has 7. So that's even more unusual. And this is starflower, looks like a star, and it's Trientellus borealis. Now, Trientellus means 1/3 of a foot, and it's probably, I would say it's probably less than 3 inches a lot of the time. It has a stem that's like a thread. I mean, I don't know, even the people in the front row you can't really see a stem holding this flower up, but there is one. It's very fine, but very wiry. It holds it up very straight. And it comes out in the spring, and it's mixed amongst the wild lily of the valley and the pasture. So we are getting close to the pasture. So that'll give you some clues, okay? We're now into the pasture. Now, this is for Betty. I saw Betty walk in. There she is. Okay, there she is. What's your city? There you go. You got it right. Okay. So this is called Quaker Lady or Bluette. Now, this is a sort of a straw vote. How many in this audience would call it Bluette? All right, and how many would call it Quaker Lady? See, I think it's just the Teele family calls them Quaker Ladies. I've stacked the deck over there. But in the South, they're known as Bluettes more than they are Quaker Ladies. And it's nothing to do with Houston. I thought, oh, this is lovely. I'll bring this for Betty. It's for Houston. It's to do with a botanist from Scotland. His name was probably Houston as opposed to Houston. And cerulean means blue. So these are charming flowers. And again, if you look at them up close, you can see these beautiful patterns in them with the yellow and the central stamens. And one of my daughter's favorite flowers, and this is rare to find. You have to look for these and trip over them and have her along with you, and then you find them. Do you know what these are? They're in the spring, in the pasture, a member of the iris family, which I didn't realize, and this is called blue-eyed grass. Now, Cicerentium, I thought I might trip over that, Montana Mountain. Well, we're not in the mountains. The Cicerentium has to do with a goat's coat and the fact that the corms of this particular plant are shaggy. So you can see how hard this is to remember these particular this particular nomenclature. But the clue is when you look at the plant, the flower itself has that little sticky point at the end of each petal, and they're very small and dainty in the pasture, and they tend to like the wetter areas. So you have to kind of be down low and up close to be able to pick them. But that's from the pasture. Any ideas about this one? I've given you a bit of a clue here because I've left some seed pods on the bottom. Yeah, it's blackberry. So rubus fruticosus, and fruit in the pasture, and I'm sure most of you in the audience remember when we had more fruit-bearing species in the pasture, including this one, blueberry, which is pretty easy to spot because we all are familiar with it. But there aren't too many blueberry bushes around, and I didn't realize this, and I'm sure you know, but it actually is encouraged by fire. So when an area is burned off, the blueberries come back. I'm not suggesting that we set fire to the pasture, but I think that fire is a regenerative method to encourage blueberry growth. And the other thing I learned today, that if you see any fruit that has that crown, that 5-pointed crown, it's not going to kill you if you eat it. So that's the trivia point about edible foods. Please do not go out of this place and eat things that you don't know what they are. And everybody will know this one, right? Forget-me-not. And I tried to figure out which different species these were, but some of these are garden escapees because people have put their garden rubbish, in places that now we think are wild places. And also there are small, there are forget-me-nots with slightly different leaf shapes, etc. So I've kind of cheated here and called it Myosotis species. Myosotis means otis, ear, mouse ear. So it was thought that the leaves look like mouse's ears. And there are several stories about forget-me-not. And one of them is that this was the last flower to be named, and the plant cried out to the great being, "Please, please, you haven't named me. Oh, then we'll call you forget-me-not." The other story is that it was worn by ladies so that they would not forget their knights, since a knight fell into a pond holding a bunch of these flowers and threw them to his lady and said, "Forget-me-not," before he drowned. So you can again, the stories are sometimes more interesting than the flower. But this is a charming spring flower. How about this one? This is looked at en face from on top, looking straight down at it.
India
It can be called that. It's usually called devil's paintbrush. It's slightly different than the common Indian paintbrush. It's the orange hawkweed. Remember we talked about Hieracium again. This is the one that's orange. And the reason I've put these two names down here is to remind me to tell you that the botanists sometimes don't have anything else to do. So every 5 years or so they have a convention, sort of like the political parties. And they all get together and rename the genus and the species of certain plants. And this one was Hieracium aurantiacum, but now some folks call it Pilacella. It's put into another genus. And I tell you this because I was relying on many of the books that were in our house that were older botany books. And I couldn't find the same names when I tried to look them up elsewhere. And it's because the names have changed. So if you're looking at plants, and that's why I suggest going to, for instance, the Wildflower site first, if you're looking for names, make sure you're dealing with the modern name, or at least appreciate that they kind of changed their names over the last 10, 15 years. Very true. Some of the botany books that I've got are, 50 years old, and they've really changed in the interim. Milkweed, absolutely, and it's coming out, again, very important to Cape Ann because it brings us all of those wonderful butterflies, and the monarch butterfly in particular. And thanks to Eleanor for the photograph here. I'm not sure you can see it with all the lights on, but it's a monarch butterfly feeding on the nectar. It's called Asclepias syriaca. Now, I like Asclepias because that's a medical term again, so I'll come back to Asclepias. But Syriaca, it's Linnaeus. He thought it came from Syria. Well, it doesn't. But Linnaeus had the final word. He was a pretty dogmatic character. So we know it for all time as Asclepias syriaca. It was named Asclepias because it was the god of healing after which it was named. And it has many uses. And the pappus, interestingly, substituted for kapok in the Second World War. It was used to stuff. I think tons of it was actually gathered and sent overseas for kapok, for life preservers, etc. The leaves are the larval food source for monarch butterflies. The nectar is high in dextrose, and so people have eaten this to survive. And we're back to John Winthrop. Circle comes around. King Charles II was sent pods by John Winthrop Jr. because the king was fascinated by this wonderful silky down that was inside these brittle pods. White campion is found in the pasture. There's quite a few of them. It only differentiated into male and female a couple of million years ago, as opposed to many. But it's used by botanists in research on sexual differentiation in plants. It's named after the Greek god of intoxication, and it has wide leaves, and that's why it's latifolia, and it's alba because it's white. But it's related to the bladder campion. You'll see this around now, and especially down at the pasture. As you go down, if you go down to the beach on the walkway, there's a lot of it all around. And this is jewelweed. It's called touch me not because it's poisonous, but if you touch the seed pods, they explode. And that's true for all the impatiens species. So jewelweed or touch me not is the common name for this. I think they're quite pretty, but they're very weedy. And wild radish, which I passed through, now looks like this on our beach. And I was surprised to see so much of it this year. I think it's much more prevalent than it has been in past years, possibly because of the winter, tides, who knows what. But these are all seed pods. So these are all going to disperse their seeds further. And again, it is a beaded seed pod. It's quite upright. It's quite specific to this particular plant, this appearance. And Raphanus raffinastrum relates to radish. Again, this particular flower sits right next door to this one, which you'll see around the beaches, and which is a rose. They're red and they're white, and rugosa refers to the wrinkled leaves. Interestingly, this comes from Eastern Asia. And then it was introduced from Europe here. It was used in part for soil and sand stabilization. It is very resistant to disease, but some places it's really gone crazy in terms of being invasive. But I think it's quite a dramatic color. I kind of like it. And the other reason I like it is that you can really use this if you want to. You can make rosehip jam. So this is the recipe, and if anybody wants it from me, feel free, they can contact me. Very good for vitamin C. And during the war in New Zealand, rosehips were gathered particularly for vitamin C to prevent scurvy, for vitamin C for children. Lovely, lovely little tiny flower that I just tripped over because I just looked down. And this is right at the margin between the sand and the soil, right at the beach. And it used to be where the old pathway was, the old boardwalk on the right. Have you ever seen this? It's sea milkwort. It's called Glaucus maritima. Glaucus means owl, but we can't find out why this particular flower is related to owls. And it's right at the tidal margin, but they're tiny little flowers, and you'll see them best probably May, June. So if you look around the rocks just to the right of where the boardwalk is now, you might be able to see it. I haven't seen it anywhere else, and I've looked, but again, I'm not here all the time, so I haven't done a comprehensive survey of all of these things. You will see iris, but the stands of iris this year are smaller than they were last year. So again, we're probably seeing variation in weather, climate, or whatever. And the two iris that we have on the beach are the larger blue flag, which is a native, and the yellow iris, which is an alien. And again, spring is the time to see those, and I think they're glorious flowers. Called iris because they come in multiple colors, and Iris is the goddess of the rainbow. And Iris was also handmaiden to Hera. And Iris is on your right of the screen, taking care of Hera and giving her honey from her jug. So Iris, the goddess of the rainbow, a great plant. Kylie didn't make it here tonight, did she? She hates this plant. She pulls it out of her roses all the time. This is the dreaded bindweed. And I'm showing you this because of the Annisquam collection, connection with this particular print from Louise Kenyon that was called Wildflower. And the problem was we could figure out most of them, but we're still having trouble with some. Now, the bindweed is down the bottom right. That's pretty easy. And the dandelion is top left. Okay? In the middle, Sarah, my daughter, said, that looks like monkshood. And I think she's right. I think it's larkspur, because there was more larkspur around here, wild larkspur, for a while. And of course, Louise Kenyon would be here in the late 1900s. The one on the top right is a bit of a puzzle. It's a graphic representation. But having thought about this, I'm wondering whether in fact that's daylily, because the native daylily is the orange daylily, and you know how common they are around here. So that's a thought, but if anybody has a better idea, we'll take it. Violet is the bottom left, and now we're stuck with that one in the middle, in the bottom middle. So the ideas have been perhaps this is an aster. The leaves don't look quite like the typical aster. It could be one of the aster family or the Asteraceae family. But this is Louise Kenyon's depiction on a Folly Cove print of the wildflowers that she saw right around the area. And I thought, this is great, because right outside what was her house, since I live in Mrs. Muzzie's house, Louise Kenyon's house, this was bindweed growing right outside the stones from her near her house. And it shows, I hope, that this was turning anti-clockwise. Can you see it? If you look at a bindweed, it actually turns opposite from most climbing plants. It goes anti-clockwise. So that's another piece of trivia for you. When you're pulling it out of your bushes, look for it to curve the right way. We're coming into autumn. Goldenrod is all over the place, and there are more than 60 species of goldenrod. So after trying to figure out which ones were which, I thought, I'm not smart enough for this. It's a beautiful golden yellow that's all over the pasture area right now. And asters are with them. And aster is I thought, this is wonderful. This is the first time that the common name is the same as the scientific name. And they're New England natives. In fact, the Michaelmas daisy, which I think is the top middle one, was actually imported to England and then renamed the Michaelmas daisy. But now it turns out, because I looked at this just recently to check up on my nomenclature, and it sounds like the botanists have moved these into a different genus and species. So asters are no longer asters in their genus name. But I'm going to call them that forever because I just don't want to learn anything else here. The last bits are loosestrife, and loosestrife was called as such because it was thought to be a flower that kept oxen gentle and quiet, that it loosened the strife between them, whatever. And I'm showing you this with a little poem. I won't read it out loud, but Millais actually drew and painted loosestrife in his painting of the drowning of Ophelia. It's up at the top right. It took him 5 to 6 months to do the actual painting of the foliage and of the flowers, and the model, who's Ophelia, sat in a cold bathtub and caught pneumonia. Her name was Elizabeth Siddal, and her father was most upset with Millais. But she was painted later and then put into the picture, if you will. And Shakespeare had written about the flowers of Ophelia, but of course, again, you have to know what the language is, and loosestrife is probably not what Shakespeare was describing. He was probably describing a native orchid. The long purple, if you look through the literature and the PhD theses that have been written on Shakespeare's flowers, it's a different flower than the loosestrife, but we have it from the pasture in that painting of Millais, which is in the Tate. Its name is Lythrum salicaria. Salicaria means like a willow. Lythrum has to do with blood, whether it's the color or something helpful for blood. But this was taken near Cindy Sam's house, and it's also taken to show you that she has vervain, which is another wildflower that was sitting in the back there. So you start looking around and you start finding wheels within wheels or flowers within flowers. My very last 4 or 5 slides, have to do with this. But everybody will call it, how many people will call it deadly nightshade? Right. That's what I learned it as. It's a very confusing flower because it is of the nightshade, but it's bittersweet nightshade. Now, that's not to say it's bittersweet. So this is very confusing. This is Solanum dulcimara. Now, if you've been in Europe, dulce means sweet, mara means bitter. So in fact, the Latins got it around the wrong way. Okay, it's sweet bitter. We shouldn't be saying bittersweet. We should be saying sweet bitter. It's a solanum. Solanum means to quieten. So it's in that family of bad drug-inducing potions. But bittersweet is Solanum dulcimara. Deadly nightshade is actually Belladonna atropina. Now, the only reason for mentioning that is just because that deadly nightshade name is often used with this. It always, around the world, it's used with this. But it's not quite the same plant as Belladonna. It's a different genus for a start. Tomatoes, potatoes, and eggplants are all relative in that bittersweet family. And this is what we call bittersweet around here, correct? But this is an American bittersweet, and it's a native to here. It was not imported like the solanums that I've shown you. This is a Calastris scandens. Calastris is an old Greek evergreen tree. Scandens means climbing. It was mistaken as European bittersweet, if you want to call it that, by the early colonists, because they had no idea they were going to come to a world with native plants. As far as they were concerned, everything was going to be the same. So they got the botanists very confused in the early days about calling what we now know as climbing bittersweet or American bittersweet something that was Europe. They mistook it for their European plants. So that is the end of this production. I've gone over time. Sorry for taking you to Wellington. Kathy Groves lent me books, gave me a book. Steve Harris did all of the work in terms of setting this up so that I wouldn't fall flat on my face. David sent around all the reminders so that we have a good audience tonight. Dee Dee's given me books and more help than she knows. And Eleanor took a lot of the photographs.